Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Spring 2022 QSide Colloquium series. We're so excited to have everybody here. My name is Halima, and I'm a senior fellow at the QSide Institute this spring. Before we begin, we would like to express our gratitude to Mr. Ross Gayron and Ms. Hong Soo for their generous donation, which has provided sponsorship for this event. So a few operational notes. At the end of this session, we'll adjourn to a standard Zoom meeting for a remote cocktail/coffee hour where we can chat more informally with one another. We also want to ensure that you're aware of our upcoming high school datathon for justice workshop, which is scheduled for April 9th, 2022 from 11:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time US. And based on the success of our previous datathon, we have decided to adapt this event for the high school level. And we're currently looking for QSide research concierges to help support our high school datathon. And this is a paid consulting position. So if anyone is interested in being some sort of like research support for this event, please contact Jude Higdon, and Jude's details are going to be posted in the chat. We're also hosting our inaugural Squared for Justice conference on April 16th, 2022. And this event is a dynamic virtual poster-styled conference, and it's an opportunity for undergrads and graduate students to present their social justice research to our community of fellow researchers. Research from all levels, from ideation through data collection, through final outcomes, are all welcome and appreciated. More information about this event will be posted in the chat. Finally, we would like to invite you to register for our Data for Justice conference, which is taking place on April 22nd, 2022. We're thrilled to announce that our keynote speaker this year will be the amazing Daniel Wood from the MIT Media Lab. More information about the speaker list and registration will be posted in the chat. Please note that financial assistance for these events are available. Please reach out to us at qsideinstitute.org for more information. We would also like to encourage any of you who are joining us today who are not officially members of our affiliate program to consider joining. The affiliate program is free to join, and you can also join us by becoming a consortium member. The consortium program is a paid membership program, although anyone wishing to join can apply for a scholarship if budgets are tight. Links to these are posted in the chat as well. So on to today's colloquium. So today's colloquium is the 8th installment in the exciting programming we have planned for the 21/22 academic year. Our colloquium series features 9 fantastic talks that will discuss issues related to theory, activism, and technical tools to shed light on a broad range of topics related to inclusion, diversity, equity, and social justice. Please visit our colloquium webpage and considering registering for them and sharing information about the other talks we have planned with your colleagues who may be interested. To watch colloquium talks by our 4 speakers, please visit the QSide colloquium playlist on our YouTube channel. While we may be in Zoom, it is important to note that the land on which QSide is constituted, what is now known as Williamstown, Massachusetts, is originally and rightfully the land of the Mohican people. We acknowledge that QSide is currently operating on land taken from the Mohican people through genocide, colonialism, and forced relocations, both past and present. We acknowledge that these forces are historic and ongoing, to highlight that this land acknowledgement exists not only in the past tense, but also in the present and the future. As the Mohican people continue to be denied of their rightful claim to this land, we thank the Mohican people for their resistance, resilience, and their stewardship of the land we stand on. We acknowledge that this statement is merely a start, and decolonization must exist in actions and not just words. QSide promises to stand along with the native people of this land and to fight the injustices of colonialism, both in its legacy and its ongoing harm. We are also sharing a toolkit made by resource generation in the chat for those wondering where to begin on taking action to support indigenous populations, present and future. As we progress through our session today, we would like to welcome questions for our speakers using the Q&A feature of the webinar. Keep in mind, your questions will only be visible to the host and the speaker, and we will have time at the end of the presentation for some answers. And now it is with great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Assistant Professor of Finance at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Sasha Indarte. Dr. Indarte completed her PhD in economics in Northwestern University in 2019, and she has a BA in economics and applied mathematics and statistics at Lancaster College. Her primary areas of research are household finance, banking, and macroeconomics. Her research investigates the causes and consequences of financial distress using big data, quasi-experimental research design, and structural economic models. Her current research focuses on the drivers of personal bankruptcy, racial disparities in personal bankruptcy, and the impact of social insurance on household debts. Recently, her project, The Origins of Serial Sovereign Default, was awarded an NSF grant. In her talk today, Dr. Indarte focuses on the persistent Black-white gap in personal bankruptcy outcomes. Her work uses national and state level bankruptcy outcome data to show how Black filers are more likely to have their bankruptcy cases dismissed without any debt relief and experience less favorable court outcomes when randomly assigned to white bankruptcy trustees. So, Dr. Indarte, you can go ahead.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, Halima. I'm just getting my screen shared now. All right, hopefully the screen share is working, but let me know if not. I want to start by thanking QSide for the opportunity to join with you all today to present this research. This is a joint work with Bronson Argyle, Ben Iverson, and Christopher Palmer. The motivation for our research comes from two different sets of facts. The first is that bankruptcy is a significant source of debt relief in the US. Just to put some numbers on it, 1 in 10 Americans have filed for bankruptcy at some point in their life. And in terms of the scale of debt relief that bankruptcy provides, it's very large. On average, bankruptcy offers filers about $150,000 in debt relief. Relative to the size of the US population, this works out to be about $832 per US adult per year. And the total scale of bankruptcy puts it on par with social insurance programs such as unemployment insurance. The second motivating fact is that research has documented a variety of large racial disparities in financial outcomes in the US. For example, median wealth of white households is 10 times that of Black and Hispanic households, working out to be about $170,000 versus $17,000. Additionally, research has found in a variety of settings that on average, minorities pay higher interest rates than whites, even when they have the same credit score or are similar across a variety of other observable characteristics. And then lastly, one other piece of recent research I want to highlight by Ganong and co-authors, what they document is that Black households cut spending 50% more in response to the same change in income, which is suggesting that overall, the sum of these other financial disparities in financial outcomes could lead to large impacts that are negative in terms of how they're affecting the welfare of Black households, essentially making Black households less financially and economically resilient. Now, motivated by these two facts, what we want to ask in our paper is if there are also racial disparities in households' access to the debt relief that bankruptcy provides. More specifically, what we ask in this paper is what racial disparities exist in personal bankruptcy and what is the reason behind these racial disparities? Now, to answer this, we do several analyses. We start by looking at what observable filer characteristics can predict or explain disparities in bankruptcy outcomes. So things like differences in income, differences in legal representation, how much are those factors underlying these disparities? After this, we then turn to looking at what we call racial homophily between bankruptcy filers and judges and trustees. Now, I'll talk a bit more about the legal environment in a bit, but for now, just to kind of fix ideas, filers, so these are the people that are seeking debt relief in bankruptcy, and the judges and trustees, these are various legal parties that are involved in determining the outcome of the bankruptcy case that the filer is bringing. Now, what do we mean by homophily? When we're talking about racial homophily, what we're getting at here is how, for example, a trustee might treat a filer differently that in a way that varies with their race. So for example, does a white trustee treat white filers more favorably than they treat Black filers? Now, what we're going to do to quantify this homophily is we're going to exploit a natural experiment, which arises from the random assignment of judges and trustees to bankruptcy cases. And one of the contributions of this paper is that we present a statistical framework that would allow even a variety of other settings to help us use data to test for the presence of racial bias and, under some assumptions, quantify the share of an observed disparity that is due to bias. In particular, not quantified exactly, but come up with a lower bound for the minimum that is attributable to bias. Now, just I'll briefly preview the main findings for the paper. So what we first document is that Black filers are much more likely to have their bankruptcy case dismissed. That means that they're going through all the hassle of bankruptcy, but without getting the benefit, the one good part of bankruptcy, which is having their debt forgiven at the end of the process. So you can think of this as basically an unsuccessful bankruptcy filing. Now, there's two different chapters of bankruptcy, and a little bit I'll talk more about the differences between them. But what I'll just say right now is that Chapter 7, which is the most common chapter under which households file, we see there that on average, there's a 4 percentage point difference in the likelihood of dismissal for Black filers and non-Black filers. This means that the likelihood of dismissal in Chapter 7 is more than double for Black filers. Now, when we look at Chapter 13, which is about 30% of bankruptcies, what we see is that Black filers are 28 percentage points more likely to have their case dismissed. So in absolute terms, this is quite a large difference. In relative terms, this is also still large. It corresponds to about a 55% greater likelihood of dismissal for Black filers. Now, when we look at what sorts of observable characteristics can explain this disparity, they end up accounting for a non-trivial portion of this. And in particular, for Chapter 7, the dismissal rate gap, it shrinks to 0.6 percentage points in Chapter 7. So it looks like a lot of observable characteristics can explain this Chapter 7 difference. Now, for Chapter 13, there remains a large unexplained gap in dismissal rates. To shed more light on what's behind this unexplained gap, we then turn to that natural experiment that uses the random assignment of judges and trustees. And in the work I'm going to present today, we've been focusing on trustees, but we're planning to extend this research to also examine judges as well. Now, what we find in this analysis is that when a Black filer is randomly assigned to a white trustee as opposed to a non-white trustee, this leads to a jump in their likelihood of dismissal. So this is plausibly due to them having, I guess you could say, the bad luck of getting assigned one trustee over another. And this jump is large. So it rises, their likelihood of dismissal rises by between 13 and 20 percentage points for Black filers. So what this suggests is that the identity of this other party in the bankruptcy case is an important determinant of the disparities in bankruptcy outcomes. Now, just to give an outline for the talk, I'm next going to give a bit more background information on personal bankruptcy. This will help with interpreting the results. I'll also talk about the data that we're using. After this, I'll go over the results that look at what observable characteristics explain racial disparities in bankruptcy outcomes and quantify the size of those disparities. I'll then turn to the homophily analysis, so seeing what happens when filers are assigned white versus non-white trustees. I'll then talk about the interpretation and relationship between homophily and bias, and then I'll conclude. So now we'll first go over some background on bankruptcy. Now, what is personal bankruptcy? Bankruptcy is a legal process that households can access to discharge unsecured debt, meaning debt that is not backed by collateral. So this would be things like credit cards, medical debt, personal loans, as opposed to things like mortgages. Now, when a household files for bankruptcy, they face some costs. Those costs vary a lot by state. And in general, they're going to have to make some kind of partial payment to their creditors. And it usually depends on how many assets that they have at the time of filing. Now, when filing, households have a choice between chapters. They can choose to file under Chapter 7, which about 70% of households do, or file under Chapter 13, which about 30% do. Chapter 7, it's for most households, it's going to be the better form of bankruptcy. One big reason is that it's a lot faster. So if a Chapter 7 filing is successful, the filer is going to receive a discharge typically within about 3 months of starting the process. Now, for Chapter 13, they, in order to receive the discharge, they only get that at the end of the bankruptcy process, which is much longer for Chapter 13. The bankruptcy process can range from about 3 to 5 years, and for almost all households, it's going to be at this upper bound of 5 years. Now, over that 5-year period, the bankruptcy filer is going to have to make some partial payments to creditors out of their income. And failure to make those payments can be something that could lead to the household getting their case dismissed and not getting the discharge of their debt at the end of the bankruptcy process. Now, in the legal process, there are 3 important decision makers. There is the judge. This is a legal official that is ultimately going to decide the case outcome. So whether it's dismissed or if there's a discharge. There's also the trustee. Now, the trustee, you can kind of think of them as the other side of the legal proceeding in a somewhat adversarial position. They're on the side of the state, and they're essentially charged with making sure that bankruptcy law is enforced correctly. And mainly this amounts to evaluating the filer's accuracy and honesty when completing paperwork about their income, their assets, their expenses, and also their debts and liabilities. The trustee is also responsible for facilitating these payments from the filer to the creditors. Lastly, we have the attorney. So the attorney is someone that the filer would get to choose. They might also not have an attorney. That's a possibility as well. And the attorney plays generally an advisory role. So recommending chapter, helping them through the reporting process, and so on. Now, in what we're going to present today, we're going to focus on the trustees. The data that we're going to use come from a couple different sources. So some of this data comes from LexisNexis, and we're also going to use case-level bankruptcy data from the Federal Judicial Center. From both of these data sets, it's going to be case-level data. We're going to have docket header information, which includes things like the filer's name, their address, what chapter they filed under, the case outcomes, and then also the identity of the decision makers, so those judges and trustees and attorneys and so on. Now, for a subset of our data, mainly from Minnesota and Florida, we currently have detailed schedule data, which means that we get a rich picture of the household's assets, their debts, their income, and their expenses. Now, what I'm going to show you today, we just have data from Florida and Minnesota, but we've recently acquired data for the entire US, and we're working on scaling up our analysis to evaluate these disparities across the entire country. Now, another important feature of our data and our data collection process is getting measures on race. So in what we're going to show you today, what we're doing is we don't directly observe people's race, but instead what we do is use a Bayesian prediction procedure of race. So basically we use people's surname and where they live in order to predict what race they are. And we're going to do this using the census surname list and 2010 block level data on racial composition. So really granular measures of racial composition. Now, something that we have in progress is for a subset of our bankruptcy filers and also judges, trustees, and attorneys, we're going to have measures of self-reported race from public records. This includes some voter registration data. Something that we also have in progress is using a machine learning approach to better predict race that will use full names, not just surnames, and also addresses as well. Now, one aside that I want to mention is that there's a lot of limitations when it comes to data on bankruptcy. There's a big lack of data on race in bankruptcy, which is why we have to do this prediction stuff. And importantly, this makes it harder for academics, researchers, policymakers, regulators to monitor and detect racial inequalities. Now, in other parts of our financial system, for example, mortgage lending, there's the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which requires lenders to report a lot of data on mortgage applications. And this includes the race of the people that are applying. And why this is useful is that it helps enforce things like the Fair Lending Standards Act and basically evaluate, are there actually racial disparities? Does it look like there's bias in mortgage lending? Now, it would be valuable to have a similar law requiring courts to record demographics for bankruptcy and arguably a lot of other areas. But this is one big hole in data, and this is one area where policy could improve and actually enhance our ability to understand and study these topics. Something I'll also highlight is that bankruptcy records are supposed to be available for free to academic researchers, but effectively they're not. PACER, the organization that holds bankruptcy data, generally turns down most requests from, many requests, I should say, from researchers to access this data for the purpose of academic research. Now, there's proposed legislation, the Consumer Bankruptcy Reform Act, which would result in many changes to the bankruptcy system, and it has not yet been passed. But this is an act that would also improve the data availability. It has language in it that would improve access to this data. So improving data access would be extremely valuable for helping more people be able to study this rather than having to invest in fancy machine learning methods and then also have to pay for additional data sets in order to study these kinds of questions. Now, with that side out of the way, a bit more about the bankruptcy process. How does filing for bankruptcy work? So in Chapter 7, the filer is going to initiate the legal process by submitting a set of schedules. So these are forms where they report their income, their assets, their debts, and so on. There's then a meeting of the creditors where creditors might engage with the filer and potentially try and make sure that they're being treated equally compared to the other creditors. And this meeting is run by the trustee. Another important feature of this meeting is that the trustee is going to be evaluating the paperwork by the filer and making sure that they're really reporting everything as accurately as possible. Now, the trustee is then going to recommend one of three things. They might recommend a discharge. That's going to be the good outcome from the perspective of the filer. So they get their debt erased and they're going to hopefully have a fresh start financially. The trustee could also recommend that they convert their chapter, saying that they shouldn't, or perhaps due to legal reasons cannot file under Chapter 7. And they might then tell them, if you want to file, you have to file under Chapter 13 instead. Lastly, the trustee could recommend dismissal, meaning that the filer does not get the debt relief from bankruptcy. And in some cases, if they're dismissed with prejudice, that means that they might not be able to file again for a number of years. So they might be precluded from accessing the debt relief that bankruptcy offers for a number of years going forward. Now, what about Chapter 13? So it starts out similarly. The filer submits their schedules. There's the meeting of creditors. The trustee can then also recommend discharge, conversion, or dismissal. But this discharge or dismissal, these outcomes are not realized until completion of that payment plan in Chapter 13, which for most people will be after 5 years. Now, if the filer successfully completes their payments, they're going to end up getting that discharge. If the trustee approves of the plan for Chapter 13 and the filer doesn't complete their payments, we can get two potential outcomes. It's possible that the filer did not make those payments due to some economic hardship that they experienced, in which case the trustee and the judge can vote for discharging the debt due to that hardship. Or when those payments are not made, the trustee and judge can then decide to trigger dismissal, meaning that the filer again is not getting that debt relief. Now, among these three outcomes, what's going to be determining and how is the trustee going to make this decision in terms of their recommendation? And what are the main reasons for dismissal? So the main reasons that are cited are things like fraudulent reporting by the filer. So for example, this might be concealing property. So they don't report some asset because they're trying to stop creditors from seizing that asset in the bankruptcy process. And the other most common reason is failure to make these promised payments in Chapter 13. Now, an important feature of how the bankruptcy system works in the US is that honestly, there's a lot of subjectivity. The trustees and judges don't have a perfectly objective criteria that they use to make these recommendations. For example, if someone omits an asset, was this just a procedural error? Was this an honest mistake? Or was this actually intentional fraud? Additionally, when it comes to these hardship discharges in Chapter 13, they are charged with evaluating, was this a household experiencing severe hardship beyond their control? Or was it not severe enough and was it within their control? And then lastly, an important piece is assessment of the feasibility of the Chapter 13 repayment plan. So again, this is another subjective criteria. And importantly, because so many of these decisions are subjective, this is one reason why we suspect that the identity of the judges and trustees might matter, and that bias might be able to enter the picture and contribute to some of the disparities that we're going to end up showing exist in bankruptcy. All right, so we'll now turn to our evidence on the size and presence of racial disparities in bankruptcy dismissals. So here in this table, what we're doing is in the first panel, in the top panel up here, we're looking at the average gap in dismissal rates in Chapter 7. So the average dismissal rate is 4%. In our lower panel here, panel B, we're looking at Chapter 13, where the average dismissal rate is 53%. And across the various columns, we're adding in a variety of fixed effects or factors that could help explain these disparities. So if we only account for the year in which we're looking at, we see that for Black filers, they're 4 percentage points more likely to have their bankruptcy case dismissed on average. So that's going to be more about double of the average dismissal rate. Now for Black filers in Chapter 13, we see a 28 percentage point difference in the likelihood of dismissal. Now, across the columns, as we add in accounting for the county that they're in, the zip code that they're in, who the judge is, who the trustee is, and then finally who the attorney is, we see some shrinking of these gaps. For Chapter 7, all of those factors explain about 1 percentage point of the dismissal rate gap for Black filers. In Chapter 13, it explains about 11 percentage points of that gap. So it drops the gap down to 17%. So for both of these, so far, there's still a good bit of unexplained variation. Something that I also want to highlight is that when we look at Chapter 13 in particular, when we look at these R squares, which are a measure of explanatory power of these factors, we can see here that the identity of the judge is about as predictive as the identity of the trustee, and the attorney doesn't add that much more explanatory power. Now, what this means is that the trustee, in a statistical sense, is about as important as the judge in determining the bankruptcy outcome. So it suggests that they're an important decision maker to examine. Now here, we're using additional data from that Federal Judicial Center, or FJC, that I mentioned, which gives us a variety of other characteristics. So things like monthly income, assets, debt over assets, whether they're filing jointly, so with their partner, do they have any non-exempt assets, did they pay their filing fee in full, and so on. So this gives us a variety of other controls and other factors that might explain some of this gap. So just looking within the FJC data, we see on average across both Chapter 7 and 13, a gap of about 7 percentage points. This drops to about 6 and 5 percentage points once we start accounting for things like the chapter, were they filing pro se, meaning that they're representing themselves, and also including that variety of controls. Now, looking at Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 separately in columns 4 and 5, what we see is that these controls appear to account for a lot of the disparity for Chapter 7. So it drops it down to 0.6 percentage points. Now, we see something different, however, for Chapter 13. For Chapter 13, there still remains about a 12.5 percentage point difference in the likelihood of dismissal. So again, this is indicating that these observable characteristics, they have some predictive power. These are some of the reasons that there exist these disparities in racial disparities in bankruptcy outcomes, but they don't explain everything. There's an important unexplained piece, mainly for Chapter 13. Now, what I next want to draw your attention to is what happens to Chapter 13 filers over time. So we mentioned that Chapter 7, which you can kind of think as the almost instantaneous form of bankruptcy, differs from Chapter 13, which typically plays out over a 5-year period. Now here, we're looking at the hazard rate of dismissal. So this is the probability of, for example, 1 year out, if we're looking at where my cursor is pointing, of having your case dismissed by that point or sometime earlier. And if we look at by the end of the 5 years, if we look at the line for just white filers, we can see that white filers are more likely than not to fail in the sense of having their case dismissed. So more often than not, Chapter 13 cases are not successful in the sense of actually leading to a discharge of people's debt. Now, if we look at this for Black filers, we see that early on there starts to be a gap emerging. It grows pretty steadily over time until about 2 or 3 years out, and it persists up until the 5th year, with almost 80% of Black Chapter 13 filers having their cases dismissed. Now, something that would be valuable for future research to explore, and this is something that my co-authors and I might also be able to dig into further, is why does Chapter 13 fail so much? And why is it failing? We're going to have something to say about why it's failing more for Black filers, but an important question for research is how can we make Chapter 13 work better for filers? Because it's ultimately, in a sense, failing for most of the people that are trying to use it. So now that we've seen that there are large racial disparities in bankruptcy outcomes, some of which can be explained by observable filer characteristics and some that cannot, we're now going to turn to an analysis of homophily. So I want to start by looking with a piece of motivating evidence for this. So what we have in this graph on the x-axis is the average IAT score, which stands for the implicit association test across counties. So the IAT, this is a test where you might have done this before, where you see words flash and you try and sort them. They might have a good connotation, a bad connotation, and it's a test that can detect whether people appear to have a negative association with one race versus another. So it gives us a measure of implicit bias, is the idea here. Now, moving further to the right, that means a higher level of measured implicit bias. And this positive correlation here, what this is telling us is that in the counties where people that take these IAT exams, the ones where people appear to have a higher level of implicit bias is exactly where we tend to observe the largest dismissal rate gap. So this is suggestive evidence that bias could play a role in driving this gap in dismissal rates. Now, next, I want to talk a bit more just to fix some ideas about how the analysis works. So first of all, what again do we mean by homophily? So this is referring to how people differentially treat others based on a shared identity. So for example, how a white trustee might treat white and Black filers differently. Our goal is to estimate the causal effect of being assigned a white trustee on dismissal rates. And we want to see if assignment of a white trustee impacts Black filers differentially. Now, to be able to estimate this causal effect, it's really important to have random assignment of the trustee. Otherwise, you could have people sorting into having a same race trustee, and the people who tend to sort might be different in unobservable ways that could also explain the disparities in dismissal rates. So for example, it could be that Black filers that are maybe less trusting of the legal system, if they could, they would prefer to have a Black trustee. But there are people that tend to do that. They might also, this trust might also be correlated with things like wealth, the types of debts they have, and so on. And so it could also be correlated with bankruptcy outcomes. Now, do we get random assignment here? So we're going to argue in this paper that we have as good as random assignment. For Chapter 7, we're lucky in the sense that trustees are actually assigned using a blind rotation system. So this is a good approximation of a random process. Chapter 13, it's a bit more subtle. So there are usually only several trustees at a given point in time within a state or bankruptcy district. Now, these trustees do appear to be rotated through case, so which trustee you get could be quasi-random. But with the way that we're going to set up our estimation, we're essentially going to be able to exploit variation in whether a state has currently Black trustees or they have non-Black trustees, white trustees, non-white trustees, and so on. So this is going to give us quasi-random variation in the race of the trustees over time within the same spaces. So for example, what we're going to need in order to buy that this is truly random assignment is that, for example, in Florida, Florida is not more likely to have a Black Chapter 13 trustee at times when unobserved factors that make Black households less likely, are making Black households less likely to have their case dismissed. So we need the presence of a Black trustee to not be correlated with these unobserved factors. Now, we do find some evidence that supports this random assignment assumption. So when we do balance tests, looking to see if there's any correlation between filer characteristics and trustee race, we don't find any evidence of that. And when we look at the assignment by race between filers and trustees, it appears consistent with random assignment. So this table, I know it has a lot going on in it, but I'm going to parse through the different columns carefully because they're going to tell us a couple different things. So in this first column, and the first three, that is, we're going to have that FJC data, which shrinks our sample down to about 500,000 observations, but gives us those detailed controls, like whether or not the filing fee was paid in full. Now, what we have here are two main coefficients that we want to pay attention to. The first one here is telling us, and again, and first this regression is pooling all chapters of bankruptcy. What this first coefficient is telling us is that there is not a statistically significant difference in the likelihood of dismissal for Black filers when they're assigned to a non-white trustee. So with a non-white trustee, there's no differential likelihood of a Black filer having their case dismissed. Now, when that Black filer is randomly assigned to a white trustee, the likelihood of dismissal jumps by 8 percentage points. Now, if we look separately within Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, we find a small gap for Black filers when assigned to a non-white trustee, and we find no difference when being assigned a white trustee. This coefficient is economically small, corresponds to about 1 percentage point, and not statistically significant. Now, within Chapter 13, we end up getting a statistically significant coefficient, but it's economically large. It's pointing to a 13 percentage point dismissal rate gap. Now, this looks like we might just not have enough statistical power in our analysis with the FJC analysis. So what we do then is turn to our full LexisNexis dataset, which gives us about 1.1 million observations. And that means that we have to lose some of those controls, but we're going to have a bigger sample. Now, when we look across both Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, we find a similar size gap. We get, as opposed to just the 8 percentage point gap, we get a 9 percentage point gap in the likelihood of dismissal when assigned to a white trustee. Now, looking at Chapter 7 and 13 separately, and the way that we're setting this up here basically allows us to exploit the size of the sample as much as possible for statistical power. So what this first coefficient here means is that Black filers in Chapter 13, when assigned to a non-white trustee, have the same likelihood of dismissal as non-Black filers. Now, when that Black filer in Chapter 13 is assigned to a white trustee, their likelihood of dismissal jumps to 19 percentage points. Now, in Chapter 7, we want to add these two coefficients here. So plus 19 and minus 19 ends up being about 0. So in Chapter 7, being assigned to a white trustee does not have a negative impact on Black filers. And adding in a couple additional controls, we end up still getting similar estimates of this 19 percentage point gap. So what this is suggesting is that the identity of the trustee doesn't seem to matter much for Chapter 7. However, for Chapter 13, where we're seeing those really large overall dismissal rate gaps, the identity of the trustee appears to matter. So when a Black filer has the result of being assigned to a white trustee, that on its own is enough to make it more likely that they're going to have their case dismissed. Now, I want to talk a bit about the relationship between homophily and bias. So intuitively, I think it probably feels that homophily is likely indicating the presence of bias, but statistically, it's really hard to isolate bias and say that something is truly due to bias, not something that's correlated with either the race of the filer here or the decision makers as well. So does homophily actually correspond to bias? And there's also a question of, if so, what kind of bias is it telling us about? There's statistical versus racial animus discrimination, where statistical discrimination is referring to decision makers making their choices. So for example, the trustee making a decision based on either accurate or inaccurate statistics, basically, ideas that they have in their head about characteristics of the filer that could be accurate or inaccurate. And there might be disparities. So for example, differences in income between Black and white filers, that could be influencing how the trustee potentially makes their decision. Now, with animus discrimination, this is usually what we kind of think of when we're talking about bias. So this is coming from some preference or distaste that causes someone to treat someone of a different race differently. Now, homophily, something that could also potentially indicate is maybe non-white trustees, and in particular Black trustees, better understand Black filers, and a common cultural background can help them design more feasible Chapter 13 plans as well. Now, outside of these notions of homophily, another question for this setting is, do trustees of different races make decisions differently based on characteristics correlated with filer race? So we're essentially going to have to assume that that is not the case in order to interpret the homophily analysis as detecting bias. Now, I'm just going to preview some of the more formal part of the paper and just give a kind of high-level summary of the statistical framework that we introduce. So in a setting where you have random assignment of decision makers, like judges and trustees, it becomes possible to identify, that is, to estimate the difference in bias between trustees. So you're not getting an absolute measure of bias, but you're getting a difference in bias. So it makes it possible then, if you can say that there is a statistically significant difference, it makes it possible to then say, yes, there is bias on the part of someone, but you're going to need more assumptions in order to rigorously say that this is, for example, bias from white trustees against the Black filers. Now, differences in Black and non-Black bias on the part of trustees can, under these stronger assumptions, yield a lower bound for average bias, making it possible to quantify the share of a disparity that is actually due to bias. Now, what is an assumption that makes this possible? We would have to assume that Black decision makers are weakly biased against Black filers. What does that mean? That means that Black decision makers, trustees, could either be neutral in the sense that if you have a person and the only thing you changed about them was their race, whether they're white or Black, you kept everything else constant, that Black decision maker would rule the same way, that they would lead to the exact same outcome. Now, if this assumption would also allow, for example, if a Black trustee would also treat more inequity, would be more likely to dismiss a Black filer. So for example, if there was some sort of internalized stereotyping that led them to treat Black filers worse. Now, there's some research in psychology that does document, in terms of implicit bias, a pro-white implicit bias among minorities, which suggests that it's possible that this assumption could hold. And again, if this holds, then we have more scope to interpret the homophily estimates as evidence of white trustees having racial bias against Black bankruptcy filers. All right, so with that, I'll take a couple minutes to wrap up. So in this paper, we show that Black filers experience significantly higher bankruptcy dismissal rates. Observable characteristics can explain most of these disparities in Chapter 7, but only about 50% for Chapter 13. Now, trying to look at what else could explain that, that additional 50%, we find that Black filers, when assigned to white trustees, see significantly higher dismissal rates. Big picture, what this is suggesting is that implicit bias among bankruptcy decision makers may be limiting Black filers' access to debt relief. These observable characteristics, and now just kind of thinking about policy implications. Now, these observable characteristics, understanding their role is useful because it tells us some of the reasons behind these disparities. And whether it's coming from bias or not, if we're interested in closing these disparities, it's useful to understand if, for example, Black filers are more likely to go pro se and legally represent themselves. And if this is one of the reasons that their cases are less successful. This might suggest that having legal aid and having a right to an attorney, like we do in many other legal settings, that could be something that could close the dismissal rate gap. Additionally, the evidence on homophily is suggestive that increased diversity among decision makers could reduce disparities. If a Black filer has a better chance of having a non-white trustee, that could lead to a more equitable outcome. And ultimately, better understanding the source of homophily is a useful direction for future research, and it would be valuable for guiding the policies that we would use to reduce disparities. So for example, if we do think that implicit bias and racial animus is the cause, then maybe debiasing training would be something that would be valuable for improving outcomes and reducing these disparities. All right, with that, I can stop here and I'm happy to open this all up to questions.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for that wonderful presentation. That was incredibly insightful. So we do have a couple of questions. The first one I have here is there a demographic in brackets, white bias in the occupation of bankruptcy trustees? So I'm going to say the question again. Is there a demographic white bias in the occupation of bankruptcy trustees?
So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but something that we did check is that the share of bankruptcy trustees that are Black is smaller than the share of the population that Black people comprise. So in this sense, Black people are underrepresented as trustees. And this gets even larger when you look at judges. So this disparity becomes even larger. So in this sense, there is a lack of diversity among these important decision makers.
Okay, cool. Thanks for sharing that. The other question I have is it possible the gap in disparities between Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 dismissal rates because there is more room for subjective interpretation in Chapter 13 cases?
That's exactly what we're thinking. So if instead there was some sort of formula that you could just apply to the numbers that people were putting in, you still might see some disparities because income is different, assets are correlated with race and so on. But then who the legal representative is shouldn't matter if it's just about numbers and a form. So one reason that we think that we are seeing that the trustee does seem to matter is all of this subjectivity. They have to make these calls, whether, for example, did someone have an honest mistake or were they intentionally trying to commit fraud?
Yeah. The next question I have here is there an appeal process for bankruptcy cases or dismissals?
There is, and that's a really good question. So that's something that we haven't looked into as much, but I think I have to see, I'm not sure if we have as good of data on that because there's a separate appeals court and we've mainly been getting, I think just like the bankruptcy courts where the original cases are filed. But that's something that we could look into. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, sure. Then the next one I have is why would someone be forced to file under Chapter 7 instead of Chapter 13?
Thanks. That's a great question, and I didn't leave time to get into the details of that. But the main reason for that is that there's a means test for Chapter 7. So your income, specifically your income, has to be below your state's median income. So you have to be in the bottom 50% of income for your state in order to qualify to file for Chapter 7.
Alrighty, and then the last question I have here is, this is more like a general sort of question. So like, why does this matter? Like, why should we look at like bankruptcy and like the discrepancy between like Black and white people when it comes to bankruptcy?
So I would say it relates to those two sets of facts that I talked about at the beginning. So one reason is, one part of that question is why bankruptcy? So the reason that we're interested in bankruptcy is it's one of the most important ways in which people can get relief from their debt. The size of the transfers that it makes to people is comparable to unemployment insurance. And given that our policy is what shapes how the bankruptcy process works, we should kind of think of bankruptcy like a major social insurance program. You can think of bankruptcy as insurance in that you fall on hard times, you get sick, you lose your job, something bad happens, and you can use bankruptcy to protect yourself and stop your debt from completely destroying your well-being. So having access to bankruptcy to get that fresh start, it's a big tool and it's an important tool. And if there are disparities in that access, I think one reason we should just care is that we as a society, if we value racial equity, if we see that there are those inequalities, we should try to understand them and try to fix them, which is the goal of this paper. But I think one could also argue that if we see these disparities, it kind of tells us that maybe, I think we want a lot of our policies to be applied in a subjective, rather an objective way. And it looks like subjectivity might be leading to unfair, unequal outcomes. And so if we want to have bankruptcy work like maybe the lawmakers intended bankruptcy to work, this identifies that there's probably a lot of scope for improvement in the process.
Thank you so much for answering those questions.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
I had one question. I was curious because you mentioned at sort of the beginning of your talk that Black households were in a more precarious position, often economically, you found. And I was just kind of curious if you would speak a little more to that, why they are in a more precarious place, and if that leads to more. I guess I was wondering too if the precarity led to more bankruptcy filing, or if actually part of the precarity came from a lack of relief, as you were describing.
So I think probably it's ultimately a mixture of both. So if we have other parts of our economy where there are disparities, so if Black house, you have a company and they're more likely to fire the Black workers than the non-Black workers, that makes Black households more economically vulnerable. They're more likely to experience distress in the first place. Some of the papers that I mentioned at the beginning, there's just this objective number that there's a huge racial wealth gap. And that paper that I mentioned by Ganong and co-authors, so what they find is that part of the vulnerability to income shocks and changes to income, the greater vulnerability that Black households experience, appears to be due to a lack of liquid assets, so things like cash on hand. So we have liquid assets like cash that you can use in an emergency versus illiquid ones like houses, where you'd have to sell it in order to use the value of that house to cope with the adverse event. Now, again, you might be able to borrow against the house, but what they find is that a lack of savings, a lack of that kind of buffer against bad events is one reason why, if you have a Black and white household, they experience the same drop in income, that Black household has to cut their expenditures by more. So I think one reason, and something that we do see in the data, is that Black households and also Hispanic households are overrepresented in the bankruptcy system. They're more likely to file. And so part of that reason are these other disparities in other parts of the economy. And then also, so not only are they kind of more often maybe having to rely on bankruptcy to cope with these adverse events, but then bankruptcy doesn't work as well for them, conditional on filing.
Thank you so much for answering that. I was kind of curious too. I have one last question. Just in terms of access, because what you're talking about, there's like oftentimes so it's like, did someone leave something out intentionally, or was this a lack of? So I was wondering if there is also a sort of disparity in access to this information, and what might be driving that, or if that exists at all.
Yeah, it's something where I think it's kind of hard to really quantify. Like, I suspect it might be true if there's, say, differences in just like financial literacy or familiarity with the bankruptcy system. That's something that could make navigating that process harder. I think maybe one other thing kind of relevant to this, so I didn't have a chance to mention these studies, but there's also been a body of research, mainly by legal scholars, that looks at the role of attorneys in the bankruptcy process, and something that they find evidence of is what they call attorney steering. So even when a Black filer has an attorney that's helping them through the bankruptcy process, they don't seem to steer them towards the best decisions. So Black filers are overrepresented in Chapter 13, even conditional on being overrepresented in bankruptcy as a whole. So what those papers have argued is it looks like attorneys are disproportionately steering Black filers into Chapter 13. And one reason that they might be doing that is sometimes it's easier to recoup your attorney fees there. And perhaps if there's bias, then they might feel less bad about kind of financially exploiting Black filers in that way. So it's something where there could also be bias on the part of attorneys. I think in our setting, we're not going to be able to, we don't have random assignment of attorneys, so it's going to be hard for us to say something rigorous about that. But this other research does suggest that that might be another area where you get disparities as well.
I'll let you go next, since we're headed towards the end. but I want to thank you again for speaking with us and giving it. This is such a lovely lecture, and we'll make sure to post online and share with our community. And yeah, I think we won't adjourn to a coffee hour this week. But thank you too for everyone in attendance and everyone who stayed by. So thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.